Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Michael Nevradakis. I am honored to have this opportunity to participate in Random Access Memories, and my presentation is titled The Greek Diaploki Phenomenon, Offline Corporatism and Clientelism's Replication in the Online Sphere in Greece. So let's get right to it. The Greek mediascape has been characterized as one that matches the characteristics of the polarized pluralist model that was put together by Hallen and Mancini in 2004. This is also known as the Mediterranean model that is found in many other countries in the region, including Spain and Portugal. And there's many characteristics about this media model in particular, including a weaker development of civil society. This has been extensively covered in the literature on Greek civil society, a tendency of political parties to fill the organizational void that exists as a result of this weaker existence of civil society. A low circulation press is another typical characteristic of polarized pluralist countries, as well as the existence of media outlets that are economically marginal, usually not profitable. Usually there is a plethora of such outlets, so they are not economically viable, and they are often reliant upon state subsidies of different sorts as a result. In these sorts of countries, along with a low circulation press, there is a centrality of electronic media. So typically this has meant television over the past few decades at the expense of the written press or the printed press. These countries also tend to have public broadcasting, I have it in single quotation marks, that is largely state controlled or state influenced, so not a very high degree of independence in terms of how their public broadcasters operate. These also tend to be societies with a low social consensus and strong social cleavages. This is certainly true in Greece and has been exacerbated during the years of the economic crisis in Greece. And the media in countries that fit this polarized pluralist model tend to be instrumentalized as weapons in political and power struggles. So the owners of these media outlets, or at least the major media outlets in these sorts of societies, tend to be very influential. They tend to have business interests all across the economic spectrum, and they use their media outlets quite often as pressure points of sorts toward the government of the day to get favorable treatment, public works contracts, all sorts of different things like that. And they use their media outlets as a threat that they would reveal scandals or unflattering news about the government if they don't get special treatment or favors. This works both ways, as we will see, however. There is a high degree of clientelism and a high degree of political parallelism in countries that match the polarized pluralist model. So there's a strong interplay, in fact, between the political system, the political parties, the government, and then the media outlets and their associated business interests. And as I was saying before, there's this two-way relationship because there's also strong state intervention in the so-called private media. And this includes selective enforcement of laws and regulations and weaker adherence to legal norms. So many times laws and regulations tend to be overlooked when it comes to things that some of these major media outlets do. And it is part of this relationship that exists between the owners of these outlets and the political system. Also, in many cases, journalists working for these outlets in polarized pluralist countries are active in political life, in political parties. Oftentimes they're even employed by these political parties. This is certainly very common in Greece, for instance. So Other characteristics of the Greek mediascape, one could say that the Greek mediascape is a characteristic of savage deregulation. This was a terminology that was introduced in the 1990s to describe this sort of phenomenon in Portugal, so another Mediterranean country, referring to the uncontrolled deregulation of broadcasting in these countries without any real significant regulatory requirements that these media outlets, these broadcast outlets would have to follow. And this creates a situation that often leads to pluralism at face value. So at face value, there's a lot of media outlets, a lot of radio and TV stations and so forth. But in practice, there isn't actually really a very wide range of opinions and perspectives being heard through these media outlets. So it's a face value pluralism rather than a true pluralism. All of this relates to something that is known as capture theory or regulatory capture, which is the idea that regulators are influenced by the interests of the industries they regulate. This matches the polarized pluralist model quite well. And this also matches one conceptualization of corporatism as well, and in particular situations where there are strong oligarchic tendencies, where there is regulation by the regulated, so this relates to capture theory, and iron triangles that exist between industry, labor, in this case the journalists, and the state itself. All of this relates to and can be summed up as one single Greek word, which is diaploki. And the diaploki could be described as the media-centric version of clientelism. It essentially refers to the interplay between media owners and politicians that determines through this power struggle who will get to influence public opinion and apply pressure in the political arena and the public sphere. Now, let's look at the Greek case specifically. Here I have an image. It's from 2008. For whatever reason, I can't find anything more recent than this. But this is a list of state advertising expenditures towards newspapers, both daily and weekly newspapers, in 2008. And in 2008, this was before the Greek economic crisis really took off. These expenditures totaled 83 million euros, 83.5 million euros. And if you look, for instance, at the #1 paper on the list, City Press, it doesn't exist anymore. It circulates under a new name, but it was published and still is published, from what I understand, by a member of the European Parliament affiliated with the New Democracy political party, which was in power in 2008, and it also happens to be in power today with a different prime minister from then. But this was a weekly free press newspaper, just given away at subway stations and bus stops and so forth. By far the most heavily funded in terms of state advertising. And then if you look down the list, number 2, number 3 newspapers were also somewhat or largely favorable to that government at that time in terms of their political leanings. Same with perhaps number 6, definitely number 7, and so on. So there's this very strong political bias that is obvious in this sort of state funding. And some very widely read newspapers that were not really necessarily so favorable to the government are much further down on this list. So that's one example. So even before the Greek economic crisis really took off in the late, around late 2009, early 2010, many Greek media outlets really were not profitable, or they were marginally profitable. They were supported by these sorts of state advertising outlays and by the owners themselves. Owners with deep pockets, of course, and a lot of influence and power within Greek society. So in the early 2000s, long before the crisis, this was when Greece had joined the Eurozone and so forth, there were already several high-profile closures of major television and radio outlets for financial reasons. They went bankrupt, essentially. Many of them, their owners were involved in various financial scandals. So there were various stations that went off the air then, but this really took off when the Greek economic crisis hit. All throughout the last decade, there were major closures of television and radio stations and newspapers. Mega Channel, which used to be the biggest station in terms of ratings in Greece, went under in 2016. And even before that, for years, it was sort of just showing reruns. It had already been having major financial difficulties. Another channel, Alter Channel, in 2011-2012, they went off the air for financial reasons. News radio stations like Flash and Vima FM, they went off the air during this decade, and sometimes they were brought back and then they went off the air again. They just could not sustain themselves financially. And the Eleftherotypia newspaper, which was a bellwether of something like the social democratic left in Greece, all throughout the mid to late 70s into the 80s and 90s and 2000s. They went under, they were brought back, they went under a second time, and that was it after that. So all of this happened during the economic crisis in Greece. And at the same time, unpopularity of journalists in the media system also grew. So, for instance, the major Greek protests of the spring and summer of 2011 had this very common rallying cry, Alites Rufiani Dimosiografi, which means, if we translated it into exact words, bums, snitches, journalists. So journalists were being blamed for not reporting properly and certainly not reporting all of the developments that ultimately led Greece to its financial crisis. Now, this is reflective of an institutional credibility crisis. I'm not going to read all of these statistics on this slide in the next couple of slides, but we see a very low level of confidence among Greek citizens in the national government, in the judicial system, the education system, in parliament, the political parties, local government, and this has been seen across many different polls. So there's definitely an indicative trend over here. High degrees of distrust toward politicians, toward elections themselves. Many people who did not feel that Greece was ruled by the will of the people, of the citizens. And in this particular poll by Diaploki, a Greek think tank conducted among young adults and their parents, again, very low levels of trust toward the political system, the justice system, and institutions in general. So the media is part of this broader structure, and levels of trust in all of these institutional structures were very low and got even lower during the Greek economic crisis years. The Reuters Institute in 2016 really specifically measured trust in the news, and Greece had the lowest levels of trust in the news media among the countries that were part of the survey. Low levels of trust in the mass media in general, and the news media and journalists. Very few people felt that the media in Greece operated independently or were free of economic influence. But conversely, and this is significant, Greeks were the third most active users of online news content, and they had the highest usage of online news portals, the highest consumption of so-called hard news stories online, and news websites and apps followed by social media sites were by 2016 the primary source of news for Greeks that were surveyed at the very least. And we see this in some other surveys. Greeks had the 5th lowest level of trust in the media according to Eurobarometer in 2015. Very low levels of trust in the mass media were recorded in a 2016 poll. In another 2016 poll, this one by Eurobarometer, Greeks were first in the usage of online radio stations in the EU. All of this is significant because Greece has among the lowest levels of broadband penetration in the European Union. Nevertheless, high levels of news consumption online and social media. So What I'm presenting here is part of a broader study for my dissertation research, which is titled From the Polis to Facebook, Social Media and the Development of a New Greek Public Sphere. This was research that was conducted between 2012 and 2017 with over 120 interviews, 5 organizational case studies, and electronic survey research that was conducted across 3 populations. And one of these case studies was an online radio station known as Radio Bubble, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Now, overall, what were the findings from this study that are relevant to us, at least in this presentation? The online mediascape replicated many of the attributes and characteristics of the offline mediascape. So we saw generous financial grants to online and offline media outlets, for instance, to air pandemic-related public service announcements. And this is something that generated a lot of controversy. We'll see an example of this in a moment. Online news sites that are also dominated by major economic interests and media personalities. We'll see more about that. And various media-related initiatives that were born during the financial crisis, but which were largely ephemeral in nature, or which ultimately ended up replicating offline or mainstream media practices. So Radio Bubble is indicative of this. We'll talk about it. Greeks largely turned their backs on traditional media, but by consuming online media, oftentimes they're consuming media produced by the same owners that are also behind Greece's offline media outlets. And the fact that there is this very large number of online news outlets in Greece, it's reflective of a trend that is similar to the savage broadcast deregulation that took place in Greece in the late 80s and the 1990s. But again, we see this sort of face value pluralism. Just because there's a lot of outlets doesn't mean that there's necessarily a lot of viewpoints being expressed. So, during the pandemic came the so-called Petsas List, and this was a list of media outlets that received funding from the state to air what should have been probably free public service announcements regarding the pandemic. This was funding provided by the state. It was part of the Menu Mespiti, or We Stay Home, campaign that ran especially during the early months of the pandemic. These financial outlays totaled 20 million euros, at least in their first phase. Well over 1,000 news organizations, including over 600 news websites, were funded through this program. And some of these news websites were not legitimate news organizations. And these outlays, again, were for the airing and publishing of what were essentially PSAs, public service announcements by these outlets. There were many in Greece who felt that this sort of funding was seen as a means of encouraging, in quotations, media outlets to provide favorable coverage of the government's pandemic response measures. Some prominent publications from across the political spectrum were left out of this list, and there were questions as to why that was the case as well. This was called, by the way, the Petsas List. It was named after Staios Petsas, who at the time that the pandemic began, he was the Greek government's spokesperson, and he was also the government minister who answered directly to the prime minister for press and media matters. Now, according to the Reuters Institute Digital News Report from this year, 2021, over half of respondents surveyed opposed the government stepping in to help out these primarily commercial news organizations with the sort of funding for this pandemic public relations campaign. This is what the Petsas List looks like. I have a link here which you could follow if you're able to access the PowerPoint. Otherwise, you can contact me. My contact information is at the end of this presentation. But if one looks at this list, there's a lot of questionable outlets, even blogs that received funding. Overseas Greek diaspora outlets were also included. And many times, a TV or a radio station received separate funding for its website, separate from the main organization. So a lot of questions were raised by this list. And it replicated practices we saw offline with the offline media. Now, we also see in Greece a trend of ownership concentration in the online media and a lot of replication of offline content and reporting. I won't go through this entire list in detail. You can see it, but you see major news websites in Greece that are owned by individuals who have interests and stakes in major offline media, TV stations, radio stations, newspapers, and then other sectors of media and entertainment and business in Greece as well, ranging from shipping to the national lottery to football and basketball teams. Now, the case of Radio Bubble, this was one of my case studies. It was one of the illustrative examples during my longitudinal 5-year research in Greece. This is an online station that gained prominence during the riots that were taking place in 2008 in Greece after a 15-year-old boy was shot and killed by the police then. That's when the station launched its RB News Twitter hashtag, and this station kind of became a bellwether of activist news reporting during this period and later when the economic crisis began in Greece. So they had a strong presence on Twitter in particular. They had a strong news department as well. This was very much unlike most online radio stations in Greece that did not have news or spoken word content. Another difference was that they were operating on a non-profit, non-commercial basis. They were based out of a cafe in Athens, a cafe space. Their studio was right there inside the cafe. And that cafe served as a hub for activist activity, for civil society initiatives that were launched during the crisis, such as Academy and Tutor Pool. And they really became prominent. For instance, the RB News Twitter feed was picked up by The Guardian during that newspaper's coverage of the June 2012 Greek elections. But all of this changed. By 2015, a crisis was ongoing, but by that point, the cafe had closed. The station reorganized as a legally recognized collective. Around half of the volunteers left, including most of the news staff, so most of the news programming ceased, and a lot of the social media activity ceased. Mixcloud was now used for a lot of its programming, so there was even less of an emphasis on the streaming, and there was more of an emphasis on music and culture rather than news and activism and information. And by 2020 and into this year, online streaming was intermittent. Even the Mixcloud account was not being updated much anymore, and few, if any, updates on social media. So we see this replication that took place. Greece has hundreds, if not over 1,000 online radio stations, but very few of them carry news or spoken word programming. Radio Bubble was one of the few, but it no longer really does so. So it moved away from what made it really unique, and it went toward a model that you could find with hundreds, if not thousands, of other such online stations in Greece. Another case is the case of Edit Open, which was launched after the Greek government shut down the national public broadcaster Edit in 2013. Many of Edit's employees operated this outlet sort of as a protest movement. And it featured initially a lot of alternative programming, focus on activism, civil society. They launched a radio service in Athens. They had a strong social media presence early on. Edit reopened in 2015 after a change of government, but Edit Open continued operating. They maintained a radio presence in Athens and their online and social media presence, but after that year, they really largely replicated the practices that one finds in mainstream news radio in Greece. Their social media presence lost its dynamism, mostly just focused on announcements. And by 2021, they were off the air on FM radio in Athens. They're still online, but they really just don't have the social presence that they had back in 2013, 2014. So, some takeaways as I am over time. State funding mechanisms were replicated in the online mediascape in Greece. Offline ownership structures were ultimately replicated online as well. New and supposedly alternative media initiatives were often ephemeral in nature, and they ultimately themselves replicated offline or mainstream practices. So here's my email address, and you can find me on LinkedIn, on academia, and on ResearchGate. In fact, on ResearchGate, you can read the full text of my dissertation. So thank you very much. I hope that this presentation was insightful, and my apologies for going a bit over time. Thank you.